Hello, everyone, and welcome to Film Independent Presents, our year-round screening and Q&A series, now virtual. I'm Brian Sheehan with Film Independent. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk all things human nature. First off, I'd like to thank some of our ardent supporters, our lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, and our screening partner, Vision Media. Today, we have a very special guest moderator in filmmaker Penny Lane. And without further ado, I will let Penny take it from here.
Okay, well, thanks, Brian, and thanks, everyone. I see the participants trickling in. It's nice to see you all. I am so excited to be able to moderate this panel today because I really love this film. I've seen it several times. I have had a really different experience with it each time I've seen it, and that's something I'm excited to talk more about today with all the panelists. And I should introduce them. So first I'll introduce Mr. Dan Rather, who you may or may not recognize. He's the executive producer of Human Nature. Adam Bolt, who's the director and co-writer of Human Nature, and Regina Sobel, who's the co-writer and editor of Human Nature. So thanks again to Film Independent for putting on this event, and thanks for asking me to moderate. Pretty excited about it. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, the first time I saw this film was actually at a film festival in, Adam, help me out, Full Frame, 2019?
2019.
2019. Yeah. And, I had a very different experience of it the first time I saw it than I did today, rewatching it. And when I tried to reflect on why I had such a different experience with it, I realized it had to do with a sense of my own fundamental optimism or pessimism about the human species. And I believe the day that I saw it in April of 2019, I was just feeling a lot more optimistic, frankly. I don't mean to be depressing, but I don't feel so optimistic right now. And so, one of the questions the film's asking us is, where we fit on that kind of bio-optimist to bio-pessimist spectrum, and how we feel about humanity's chances of wielding such a powerful tool, a tool that allows us to change fundamentally who we are as a species. Do we really have what it takes in terms of intelligence, knowledge, ethics, and all the above to wield this tool in good ways and not in bad ways? And I guess I just wanted to get a temperature check from the panelists about that question. Where are you at in terms of that spectrum today? I'll start with Mr. Rather.
Well, first of all, know this about me, that by experience and by nature, I am an optimist. I agree with you that this is one of the more difficult times in our lifetime in which to be an optimist. But we have to recognize the other is you can be an optimist and still be a realist. We all recognize as adults that part of being an adult is to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be. And by any reasonable analysis, this is a particularly perilous and pivotal time, not just in the history of our own country, but it's not too much to say in world history. And it isn't just Trump and the rise of autocracy and tribalism around the world and in our own country. It's climate change, it's racial justice, it's income inequality, and scientific breakthroughs, particularly the unique scientific breakthrough that is CRISPR. It's absolutely essential going forward to come to grips with these feelings within ourselves of, gosh, is the human species changing? Is there any hope for the future? Frankly, I think it's absolutely vital that filmmakers, particularly independent filmmakers, have the freedom and support to tackle these issues. Because if ever there was time for us to whisper the word steady to ourselves, this is the time. And then metaphorically, we need a lot of places issuing sort of whispering, steady, steady, steady. Don't succumb to absolute pessimism, but on the other hand, be as optimistic as you can, but it has to be realistic. That's where I think films can provide a particularly important role for all of us. It's one reason that I'm so pleased to be in the film business in a way. My career is all journalism, and in many ways, what I know about making films could be written on the stomach of a germ. That I'm not a filmmaker by nature or by training, but thanks to Adam and Regina and Elliot Kirshner, who's involved with CRISPR Film, mightily involved with it, that they taught me a lot. But that's when I come out on the question of how we can view today. But there's no getting around that this is, as I say, a particularly dangerous and decisive time, not just for our own country, but in world history.
Yeah, thank you. Regina, how are you feeling today?
I don't know. I feel like I'm going like woo all over the place constantly, which was my experience of working on the film also, and my relationship to optimism and pessimism and this technology. I mean, I think I somehow at the same time feel both pessimistic about certain aspects of humanity, but somewhat cautiously optimistic about science. I think, I mean, I went back and forth a lot in the making of the film, as did everybody, I think, who was really, intimately involved in making it. We were all sort of bumping up against our own assumptions and one another's, and really feeling this push-pull, which we tried to, make really apparent in the film as well, that we were sort of constantly questioning our own feelings about it. I think I landed somewhere, maybe closely aligned with Alta Charo, one of the bioethicists we interview in the film, though maybe a little bit more cautious than I think she comes out to be. Yeah, I think that's where I am today.
Good. And Adam?
Oh boy. Well, one thing, I mean, first of all, I'm glad that, in rewatching the film, you had that experience of feeling both sides, because that's something we really wanted to pull off, is kind of have the pessimists see some reasons for optimism and have the optimists see some reasons for pessimism, and kind of challenge everything. But one thing that influenced me a lot as we were making the film was watching what was going on with the technology of the internet over the course of making the film, because we started working on it in like 2016, and at that point I think we were still in it's kind of the end, I think, of like the innocent phase about the internet, that it was just going to democratize information and give everyone access to to knowledge and communication, and just
Bring
and I grew up
together.
Bring everyone together. And I, I'm kind of part of the first generation that grew up with the internet and was a big computer nerd, and just, the kind of person who just couldn't wait for the next iPhone and all that stuff. So, and then we've seen kind of a reckoning, I think, with that in the last 4 years, certainly for all kinds of reasons, leading right up to the events of recent days. And I think it kind of poses a question of the capabilities of technology, the things that technology, the possibilities that it unlocks versus what do people actually do with it. And it's, often we're not that good at predicting what people actually do with it. The kind of dystopian nightmare about technology, 50 plus years ago was like Big Brother, and now it's big data, or it's lots of individual people doing things that you can't predict. So we tried to kind of think about that, even though it's part of it is just that you can't predict it, and so we tried to think about that with CRISPR. What are the things in 50 or 100 years with this technology that we can't predict? But to sound a little bit of an optimistic note, I mean, I think another thing we're seeing right now is with COVID, certainly, is the importance of science, and the fact that, I mean, I'm not to get out of my depth because I'm not a COVID expert at all, but the fact that this vaccine, for example, was produced in such record time has a lot to do with genetic technology, actually. It's not related to CRISPR, but they were able to do it so quickly because they could analyze the genome quickly. They took a little snippet of the genome, and that's part of how this new type of vaccine works. So I don't know. I don't have a clear answer, but you know, that's all the confusion we tried to put into the film.
That's great. I wanted to ask, actually, Mr. Rather, if you could talk about, do you remember the first time you heard about CRISPR, and what did you think when you heard about it for the first time?
Well, the first time I heard about it is when Elliot Kirshner, whom I mentioned earlier, is the main executive producer on the film and the red beating heart of the film getting made. Elliot is not a scientist, he's a journalist, but he comes from a family of scientists. And he sort of mentioned offhandedly CRISPR. I had no idea what he was talking about. And as he tried to describe it, frankly, he might as well have been speaking Norwegian or High Norse or something. I didn't understand it. But what I did understand is that Elliot thought that, that it might develop into a big story. And so he set up a couple of, I said, well, I smell a big story here. At that time, we were not thinking about a film. Just, we're story hunters, story breakers, storytellers. This sounded like a hell of a story. So we set up a series of short series of interviews on the West Coast, particularly at the center with Dr. Duda and others who were working on it. In answer to the question, though, as soon as I got into the interview in which she's won a Nobel Prize, she had a Nobel Prize since then at the time, began to explain what CRISPR was, I was saying to myself, this story is not only a big story, but, and I swear, I thought at the time, this could be one of the biggest stories that I can cover. So in answer to the question, I came out of that first interview saying to Elliot, we have to get on this like a hawk on a rabbit. We have to jump on this story and go as far as we can go with it. And very quickly we began to say, well, maybe we should make a documentary film in addition to making a news report. We might make a documentary film. So from that moment on, the enthusiasm for the project of making the film, the sense that we might even, if God smiled and we were lucky, we might even make an important film. Now, pretty quickly, we got to the filmmakers themselves. And once we got to, the two people, Adam and Regina, then we were really rolling. But I will say, as anybody who knows anything about filmmaking, particularly independent documentary filmmaking knows, we had all those crucial moments of where do we find the money? We're too deep into this with our own money in our own time. And will anybody ever understand this? Is it too complicated? And in making the film, I would add that, this is a little off point of the question, but you said when I first heard it, I recognized that this was going to be really hard to do. And as we went through, we constantly had those questions. How can we make it a film that the scientists involved will say they got it right, and at the same time, the audience can understand it? That was the biggest challenge. Now, others will have to make an opinion as to whether we succeeded or failed, but we were trying very hard. Number one, this film has got to have integrity, the kind of integrity and savvy that the scientists will say it's okay. The second thing was then to make it understandable for people who don't have a strong science background, which after all is most people.
Thank you for that. And I guess just picking up on that, Adam, I wanted to ask you, so one of my favorite things about the film is actually the way it looks and the way it feels. There was a lot of jokes a couple of years ago about the kind of overuse of drones in documentary films, right? But I have to say, this really stands up as a really intelligent, purposeful use of drones, because part of what you get from the film, just from that first scene to the last scene, is this incredible sense of scale and the sort of sweep of history and the arc of civilization and the planet beyond civilization, human civilization as well. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that a little bit. How did you come up with the sort of way that you wanted this to look and feel? And I guess the other question that might be related is kind of like why you wanted to make this film, actually, like what your artistic hopes were beyond communicating an important story.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, as far as how the film looked and just the sort of the style of it, I mean, we really, from the beginning, I wanted this to be a cinematic experience. I mean, unfortunately, I mean, and it was for it was for many people when we were on the film festival circuit, and then we actually opened in New York on March 13th for our planned theatrical release, which was the day that you know, New York went into a state of emergency, and we basically had to tell people not to come to the theater because it wasn't safe. But that aside, I mean, I love the experience of seeing a movie in the theater. And one thing I love about that is you can't change the channel. And so if you pull people in at the beginning and you kind of have their attention, you know, you can create lots of space for people to kind of put themselves into the film and not just bombard them with information. So we wanted the film to be big. We wanted it to be beautiful. We wanted it to be, you know, have slow moments and fast moments. And we wanted, I mean, another thing we spent a lot of time was thinking how to interview these scientists. We really wanted the film to be, you know, we don't have a narrator. We didn't want it to seem like some kind of lecture, you know, the kind of thing that would get like rolled in on the AV cart in your high school science class or something and put everyone to sleep. We wanted people to feel like they were sitting down across from these really interesting people, the scientists, the ethicists, and the patients, and kind of taking it in the way that I did when I was interviewing them, and kind of have something like that experience of, you know, meeting someone and kind of being like, oh, interesting, and then meeting someone else and going totally the other way. And so, you know, we shot it in a way where hopefully it kind of feels like you're in the room experiencing that. As far as what drew me to the film, I actually, as Dan was talking about his interview with Jennifer Doudna, who is in the film, but he interviewed her early on before we set on the idea of making the film. And I remember something from that interview that struck me. She talked about, you know, this was years ago. So at that point, CRISPR was really pretty unknown outside of the scientific community. And she talked about her awareness of the power of this technology, and then kind of going about her daily life. She mentioned like going to a PTA meeting at her kid's school and just looking around the room and realizing no one knew about this stuff that was going on in her lab. And, you know, how do you get people up to speed on this kind of thing? So it was appealing to be part of that process of, you know, like this, I mean, a technology that's so transformative. It's like the opportunity to make a film about the transistor, or, you know, the splitting of the atom or something, and really tell the story of what it was like for the scientists who were there, who discovered it. But also, maybe the thing that was most interesting to me was just this conflict that the scientists themselves had, and, you know, realizing the ethical implications of something that for most of them was kind of I don't want to say an accidental discovery, like, you know, that there wasn't a lot of brilliance in the discovery, but most of these scientists weren't, you know, sitting around trying to invent an earth-shaking genetic engineering technology.
No, in fact,
right?
One of them was trying to like make yogurt, you know, work
exactly.
better.
Yeah, make yogurt work better. You know, just a lot of them were just trying to understand how different aspects of the natural world work. And then these all, you know, and it's lots of scientists all over the world, and these pieces come together, and then it's kind of this Pandora's box. And it was really interesting to me that, to my surprise, most of the scientists were pretty cautious about, some of the most sensational uses of this, particularly this idea, what they call germline editing, which is using CRISPR to change the DNA of, future generations of unborn children and that kind of thing. Like, I was expecting a kind of like PR kind of, oh, well, we need to be cautious. But, part of the benefit of spending a lot of time with these people and interviewing them for hours and hours was that I got a real sense that no, like, it's kind of like, oh, right, these people are also just people and have kids and families and live in the world, and they want the world to be safe and they want things to be good. And there was, real concern on a visceral level that you could sense from a lot of these scientists about crossing certain lines. And that was interesting, just the idea of like having this job and then being caught up in a kind of potentially world-changing ethical debate that you were, you never signed up for. So that's kind of, that was the interesting thing I wanted to capture.
Yeah, to the extent that there seems to be real like techno optimists in the film, kind of unsurprisingly, they're more in the kind of startup entrepreneurial side of things. At least that's the impression that I got. I guess like just as a thought, just that I wanted to put it out there, for me, when I was rewatching the film yesterday, the word humility just kept coming into my mind. Just kind of back a long time ago, when Aristotle said, I don't know, that's like a really important aspect of what we've been able to do as a species, is acknowledging the limits of our own knowledge. And I think that might be the main feeling that I had today, that this week, that was so different from when I first saw it. I think when I first saw it, I was like, we've got it, we're gonna do it, we're gonna like figure it all out. And now I'm like, we don't got it, like we don't know. And I think that most scientists, when you really talk to them about their field and you get deep into what they're doing, they tend to acknowledge that the more they learn, the more mysteries are unveiled. So that the invention of CRISPR doesn't dispel the mysteries of almost anything, really, other than how to do this one thing with Cas9, right? Anyway, I just wanted to say that because that was one of the feelings I had. But I wanted to ask Regina a question as editor and co-writer. What were some of the principles or rules, formal or otherwise, that you developed over the course of putting this story together? How'd you keep it all from spiraling out of control?
A great question. There were a few things that when I came onto the project were sort of already set, and like, as an editor, you're responding to the material that some of which is already shot. Obviously, we weren't totally done filming when I came on, but what was already really clear when I came on was that we had these very lengthy, very fantastic interviews that were done by Adam and were really quite nuanced. And like he said, we really wanted to treat the scientists like people. And I think I was surprised by how sort of like not media trained their interviews came across, because especially some of these scientists have to get on, a talk show or something and like give their little 30-second clip moment about what is CRISPR. And I think like it was a testament to Adam's interviewing skills. And also we were lucky enough to have a producer, Sarah Goodwin, who's a PhD cell biologist herself, that I think, going in, I think the scientists felt kind of like, okay, these people are taking us seriously, they're going to really listen. So we had these great interviews. And then Derek Reich's cinematography, like you mentioned, there was already this there was like a pace inherent in both the interviews and just the way things were shot, that it was, and this took us a little bit of time to figure out. It wasn't just like, oh, ding, 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 but that, we wanted people to be able to speak at length, really in their own words. We felt the same way once our producer Meredith de Salazar cast David Sanchez, who is, extremely important for the film. And we treated him like an expert as opposed to a patient, because he is an expert of living with this disease. And so I feel like we really wanted to stick to realism. Something else I was really struck by when I started was that all the footage that was done in the labs was like scientists, in most cases, it's not true across the board, weren't wearing their white coats. They had their gloves on. It was quite relaxed. And I gather just sort of what it's really like when you're working in a lab day to day. There was none of this, you know, you often see whenever there's something, especially about genetic engineering, there's like, they turn the lights off in the lab and everybody's like piping gels. And it looks like it's the middle of the night. And it's like, why, they can't work in the dark.
It's like the CSI look.
Yeah. So we sort of like, cinematic was important, but realism was important. And this also gets to what Dan was talking about, was just having integrity and journalistic integrity. We felt very strongly that we wanted to present as real as possible while still making it a good story, still making it interesting. So of course, like, you know, you're constantly juggling where you can dive deep and where you sort of have to skim a little bit. But I think those were sort of those were some kind of tenets that we kind of clung to, I think, in the making. And then, I mean, I felt very strongly that this needed to be an emotional journey. And that was something that took a lot more time, I think, to craft and figure out and massage. But those were the various, among other things, but some of the things we were juggling, I think, in making it.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up David, because I wanted to ask about David. And for anyone who forgets, David is the little boy with sickle cell. It's sickle cell anemia is the name of the disease, right? With sickle cell, who kind of bookends the film. Really, we start with him and we end with him. And I wanted to ask about casting. I feel like we don't talk about casting a lot in documentaries, but it's actually a huge part of what we do. So yeah, how did you find David, and how did you make the decision to sort of bookend the film with his story? That could be Regina or Adam, whoever wants to answer it.
Well, Regina, maybe you should start. I mean, my memory is that I had some sort of, I had some resistance a little bit to how important a story like David's would be in a kind of contrarian way. I was like, well, there's always like the patient, and, you know, often I feel like it's handled in a kind of cloying way, you know, where it's like just checking a box and you pull the heartstrings and then move on. But, you know, in my memory, we had a meeting kind of screening some of the early material before we had filmed David. I mean, we knew we needed something like that, but I didn't appreciate how important it would be.
Yeah.
And then, I mean, Regina really put her finger on something with sickle cell in particular, which maybe you could talk about it as far as like, you know, kind of how to use that to sort of help with the science. But go ahead and jump in if.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the team was excited about sickle cell, first of all, like the first identified genetic disease, and yet has had far fewer sort of the amount of research and changes in the technology that have helped people who are suffering from sickle cell has kind of been like blood transfusions have been the name of the game. But because it's a sort of relatively, it's the reason it was identified first is because it is just a single letter change. And so, of course, the idea of CRISPR being able to, and now there's been some clinical trials and it's been shown to work, which is fantastic. But basically, like between there being so little focus on diseases like sickle cell, it's typically other diseases that tend to affect more like, you know, Caucasian European lineage. So there was that, but I also felt like, I mean, when I came on, we had all the interviews with the scientists, and some of them were really dense, but we felt very strongly that we needed to like get into the science, and we wanted very, very much to really tell the story of CRISPR, but it was like, how the hell are we going to explain like remind people about DNA, base pairs, how big the genome is, like, let alone get into the actual engineering aspects of it. And so I felt like if we could use sickle cell actually as a way to explain the science as well. So it's really the first, we kind of dive into getting into both the story and the visual language of DNA and changing things and what a single letter looks like compared to the kind of like galactic scale when you're teeny tiny of the genome. And so I felt like maybe, and this was before we interviewed David, I was sort of hopeful that this would be something we could use as a way to start explaining the science, which we did end up doing. And I think it worked. I think it was a smart thing.
It does. It works really well. And I just want to say for the record that I would have been on Adam's side of that argument, but Regina was right. And it really matters, you know, like I tend to get overly intellectual about things. And then at some point in my own filmmaking, I'm like, oh, right, like emotions matter. Like we got to put those in the movie too. And I can really see how much less impact this film would have on me if David hadn't been in it, really. You know, even though I loved everything else in it, I think David makes everything feel real. It brings it down to the individual level, which is what you need to do with something so complex and abstract. Adam, did you want to say something before we go to audience questions?
I was just thinking about something Regina said earlier about treating David like an expert as well. And to your question about casting, I mean, well, first of all, I think, something you realize is just that when you have a disease, you become an expert on that disease. But David in particular was just one of those people that just immediately you're like, this is the person. How
did you meet him?
So we did once I was sort of reluctantly convinced that we should really get on this thing of finding someone who would benefit from the technology in a tangible way, and we settled on sickle cell. I actually stole another idea from Antonio Regalato, who's a journalist that we interview in the film, and he had done an amazing article about muscular dystrophy, which is another disease that CRISPR can potentially help. And he had this scene of a young man living with this disease who was interested in science, and actually like they brought him into this lab to look at the experiments that they were doing on his own cells, which they were using as like a kind of trial of the technology, just in a petri dish. And so that, I mean, kind of the realization that you could be living with a disease and then scientists kind of take your cells out of your body and are using your cells as the test case, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it's going to help you, depending on how serious the condition is. Just such an emotional, fascinating kind of situation. So we kind of, Meredith, our producer, called all the clinical research places in the US that are doing research on sickle cell and CRISPR, and we worked with them, to identify people. They there's a lot of confidentiality issues, so they had to kind of get back to us about people that they thought would potentially be open to it. And we talked to a bunch of different people, but David just, even talked, I was going to say he lit up the screen, but he even lit up the phone when we talked to him. So
yeah, I believe
it was a pretty
that.
easy decision.
Really some very memorable cinematic moments with David. So let's actually get a couple questions from the audience. And so just because we're already talking about this, let's start with Paul's question. He says, what's the latest in CRISPR being used to cure rare genetic diseases like sickle cell? So do we have any substantial updates since the film was done that we can speak to?
Yeah, and I should give the usual, I'm a filmmaker, not a scientist disclaimer. But since the film was finished, there's a number of clinical trials for sickle cell that are ongoing, but there's at least one patient and maybe more at this point who seem to have been cured. So it's still in the clinical trial process where they're, seeing how safe it is, but it's looking extremely good that this is, that they're going to be able to develop a, curative treatment out of this. And just, I still get Google alerts for CRISPR, so
Yeah.
I'm going to try to stay up. I mean, every week.
You're never really done with a film until you turn off those Google alerts.
Every week there's another development with, there's all kinds of different conditions that they're making progress with. So there's certain forms of blindness. The thing I read about a couple of days ago is a rare disease that causes premature aging that they've just been able to cure in mice, which is how they start, and then they'll move to humans eventually. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening. I mean, then the big question, which we could get into maybe, is how much it costs and who has access to it and all that. But the technology is proving itself.
Great. So another question is there anyone working on your side regarding showing this documentary to students, people in schools, workplaces, medical psychology, ethical studies?
Yes, and anyone else jump in if they want to add to this, but yeah, it's been a little bit of we've had to kind of scramble to rethink our strategy with COVID. We had a huge number of school groups lined up for the theatrical release, and then we've been like converting those to virtual things, and there's a lot of interest from teachers. The film is available through some system whose name escapes me that is available for like it's a lot of universities have access to it for free through their libraries now. Of course, it's also on Netflix. So yeah, the one thing that I'm really sad about is just missing out on the opportunity to see it with people at the same time and take it all in together. But it's definitely being used as a tool in lots of different kinds of educational settings.
Oh, let me chime in here that Elliot Kirshner, whom I mentioned a number of times, is an executive producer. He spends part of every week on this very challenge of how to get the film exposed as much as possible to student groups and other individual groups. As anybody who's ever been involved with any independent documentary filmmaking, how big that challenge is. But the answer is that we spend part of every week, I can't say part of every day, but part of every week on that very thing. Getting the film on Netflix has helped a lot, because when someone says, I'm desperate to see the film, you can always say, well, look, we wish we could send you a copy, or wish we had some distribution system to take care of students, but at the very least, you can get up on Netflix and get the film. But I do want to loop back to something you said earlier about keeping the film up to date with developments. That I think it's important to emphasize that CRISPR, the echoes of CRISPR is going to resonate through the rest of this century. We're just on the first faint cutting edge. And when people ask the question, well, what besides sickle cell anemia, there are thousands of questions already. And one reason we wanted to make the film now, and one reason, without being self-serving, we think the film is important, is for people to ask the questions now, the big questions about, well, is it any control on this kind of science? And if so, who's to control it? How's that to be structured? Those questions need to be asked now, while we're still at the front edge of CRISPR, rather than it was, say, for the instance with the internet, of having it make some deep inroads into society, both negative and positive, and then begin asking questions. So I do want to emphasize that our hope with the film as it gets more distribution, is that it will spark these kinds of questions of where do we go with this? Because CRISPR is not going to go away. To say it'll be with us, CRISPR is going to be, some version of CRISPR is going to be a story that stays alive for most, if not all, of the 21st century.
Absolutely. I think we have time just for a couple more questions. So one of them is, what were your cinematic influences for this film? Asks Rodrigo. I felt shades of Malick and Crowley, but wanted to know if I was off base.
Wow, that's, well, yeah, Malick definitely was something we were watching. Koyaanisqatsi, and also other films. There's a film called Samsara that the DP of Koyaanisqatsi made. Just that, weirdly, like a lot of films that have no words in them, because we knew this would have a lot of words, but kind of looking for inspiration for how you could say things without saying them, because we knew we had to say so much with words. So it was sort of like, what could we say without words? Regina, would you add anything to that?
I mean, I feel like it have to add Errol Morris to the list, at least in terms of how we interviewed people. And I don't know, A Brief History of Time, I think definitely entered. I remember rewatching some of the beginning of that movie just to like see how they're doing it and introducing people. Yeah, but otherwise I think you hit
my favorite scene in the film is absolutely the archaeological dig. I mean, when I first saw this film, I remember that was the scene that made me think like, this is an artistic accomplishment. Like, this is a film that has artistic ambition. That scene was not necessary to tell the story of CRISPR whatsoever, but it added, sorry about the cat, it added so much, again, to the sense of monumental history, to the history of civilization, to the march of knowledge, and the sense that there's much we don't know yet, and that one day someone will dig up our society and marvel at all the things that we didn't know, you know? Okay, so one last question, Adam and Regina, what is your next project? Asks Anonymous.
Well, as you know, Penny, I'm working with you on something. I don't know if that's ready to be talked about, but I'm thinking, I mean, I'm really interested in technology, so I don't have a specific project queued up, but I'm really, I'm very interested in the internet and the history of it, and kind of what, I've been doing some reading about the very beginnings of the internet. People may know that some of it came out of this thing called ARPANET, which was in the Defense Department. But it was actually kind of all these academic people who in a way kind of infiltrated the Defense Department in terms of taking advantage of all the money they have, with this very optimistic vision of, you know, what this technology could accomplish. And so I'm exploring that area just in terms of the early ambitions of the internet versus where we've ended up with it.
I think that's great, because one of the questions I wanted to ask you was how you were feeling about the task of science communication. If you were like, all right, did that, time to move on, or if it was something that you felt passionate about and wanted to do more of. It sounds like the latter.
Yeah. I mean, well, I think I'm attracted to things that are really complicated because I think film has such potential to explain things and also do more than explain, but you can just, I mean, you get so much out of what people say and how they say it. And also, you know, I mean, we didn't even touch on graphics, but that was, for this film, was such a huge part of the feeling of the film. And we worked with Ned Piedarkorn, our amazing motion graphics artist, for over a year all throughout the editorial process. And that was just a revelation. He's an amazing artist, and just sort of appreciating everything that he could put into the graphics that we didn't have to say, like you just understand visually like the complexity of DNA, but also its kind of elegance and the way that these pieces, these little biological components kind of fit together like a lock and key or something. And you appreciate, like we really wanted to make these cinematic moments where you appreciate the scale of things or the insignificance of something. And we could do that with these sort of graphic scenes without anyone having to hit you over the head with some soundbite about, you know, how big something is, you know, some number or something. You could just sort of feel it. So, so I don't know. I really love the use of graphic, like being involved in that process and kind of using it to, I think, to bring people into things that often they're intimidated by, like, you know, people who don't consider themselves to be science types. And I think often that's just because of bad experiences with teachers or people who kind of want to hold science over you as something that's really complicated. But I think it doesn't have to be. And I think, you know, I like breaking down that barrier and bringing more people into things that are often people are shut out of.
Well, I'd be very interested in doing other things with science. I just feel so strongly that we need more science in filmmaking, films about science. We need much more news about science. We've all been a little afraid to tackle these scientific subjects. We can't be afraid of it, because these scientific breakthroughs, things like CRISPR, as I say, CRISPR stands alone, unique, but these scientific breakthroughs in technology, they're going to define who we are as we go forward. So I'm interested in making more films about science, which will strike a lot of people as sort of humorous, because I wasn't good in science in high school. I don't know a lot about science, but I like to think I know a good story when I see one and hear one. And so I'm very interested in doing some more projects having to do with science.
I'm so glad to hear this about all of you. I can't wait to see what you make next. I want to thank you all for coming. Sorry to the people whose questions we didn't get to, but there was a lot to talk about. And thanks again to Film Independent. And yeah, thanks for such a great film.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny, for a great conversation.